nice, dark Portsmouth. It's amazing how the weather changes on us. My name is Craig Clark. I'm the president of the Portsmouth Historical Society. I just want to welcome you tonight to our talk on the Indigenous people in Portsmouth. I'm really looking forward to this talk. Some fun announcements. Tomorrow, we were asked about a month and a half ago, the Rhode Island PBS, they have a series called Treasures Inside the Museum. And we were asked to participate in that. And they shot us redoing the schoolhouse roof. And they're going to be here tomorrow at 9 to look at some of our hidden treasures in the museum. So we hope that first quarter 2024 that will be airing. If you haven't seen or noticed, we reshingled the schoolhouse and the south side of the church. And we were happy to hear yesterday that we received a $30,000 grant from the Champlin Foundation to cover half the cost of that. So we were really thrilled with that. And Becky Sattel, our vice president, was instrumental in submitting that grant. So a few other announcements. December 6th, we're having our annual meeting. It's going to start at 6 o'clock in right here. December 6th, our annual meeting. We're going to go over what we accomplished this past year and plans for 2024 and beyond. We have some good plans for finally a big one thing we're going to tackle this coming year is a elevator outside for everybody. That's been something long in coming, so we have a plan in place, and we're going to start some fundraising for that in 2024. January 29th, we are hosting, Jim Garman's going to be speaking at the Common Fence Point Community Center on the Secana River Bridge construction, Mount Hope Bridge, history of the Mount Hope Bridge. So hope you can join us there. So without further ado, I want to introduce my fellow board member, Stephen Luce. He's a Portsmouth High School graduate. In 1998, he was in the Army for 4 years and then 7 years as an Army reservist. Stephen graduated from the University of Missouri in 1997 with a BA in psychology and a minor in history. He worked many years in government. He worked in the state of Missouri and the city of Newport. Most recently, the town of Portsmouth. In 2018, Stephen enrolled at URI, and in 2021 obtained his Master's of Arts in History and Archaeology focus. He has worked for several archaeological digs and most recently completed a survey of all the historic cemeteries in Portsmouth, along with recording several new burial grounds and markers. And next time I'll bring my glasses. So, thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you, Craig. All right. Good evening. Thank you very much for that introduction, Craig. He may have said I graduated from Portsmouth High in 1998. That would make me 10 years younger than I am. I wish I did. 1988 is when I graduated. Let's see if we got this working here. Okay, so I'm going to be speaking about the Indigenous peoples in Portsmouth during the colonial period. Roughly, it's going to be about 150 years from, say, 1610 to 1760. I'll be going backward and forward in time a little bit, although for the most part, it'll be chronological from the oldest time to the more recent. This picture on here that I used is titled The Narragansett with Roger Williams. Specifically, the one Indigenous individual is said to be Canonicus. We don't know exactly what he actually looked like, but it's a very good old picture of that. So what I would like to do now is just a quick overview. Let me first start out by saying that I myself am not Indigenous, that I encourage everyone, if you're interested in any specific nation, specific tribe, whether it be the Narragansett, the Mashpee Wampanoag, or the Pokanoket, that you contact them directly and get any information that you're curious about, directly from them. The lecture I'm giving tonight is basically going to be from the English point of view, because all of the historic records were written by the English. So they're going to be a little bit biased, but we're going to, kind of work through that a little bit. And as far as acknowledgments, I do want to thank the Narragansett Indian tribe. specifically Lorenz Spears and Max Scott for their advice that they gave to me. Also want to thank the Mashpee Wampanoag Museum. They provided a lot of information to me last year. And I want to thank the Pokanoket Nation and the leaders there. They have recently provided me some additional information that I found very helpful. For terminology, two things that I want to sort of clarify. The biggest term to clarify is the term Indian. Now, it appears everywhere in the records, and because that's how, for the most part, the English refer to the indigenous, were as Indians. And that term has both positive and negative connotations through the centuries. As it is, many indigenous people accept that term. Some do not. The Narragansett, for example, the official name of their tribe is the Narragansett Indian tribe. What I've heard from indigenous people is if you know the tribe or the nation that someone belongs to, it's best to use that. So if you know if a person is from the Narragansett, then refer to it that way rather than saying Indian. If you're going to use a more general term, I've been told by some Narragansett that they do prefer indigenous. Indigenous is a very good term that really denotes who they are. The other term we want to talk about, and the next background of the Narragansett and the Pokanoket, Wampanoag. So the other term is, are we talking about the Wampanoag or the Pokanoket? What are those two terms? Prior to 1675, if you're talking about the confederation of tribes that existed in southeastern Rhode Island, southern Massachusetts, it would be under Pokanoket. They did not use the term Wampanoag at that time. Now today, Wampanoag, and since 1676, the term Wampanoag has been used to describe that confederation of tribes that used to be under the leadership of the Pokanoket. But after the War of New England, otherwise known as King Philip's War, the English did not want to acknowledge the Pokanoket any longer. They wanted to completely eliminate all reference to that nation. And so they started using the term Wampanoag to refer to the local indigenous people here in this area, the Pecasset, the Sakonnet, the Acushnet, and so on. So it's a term that some people accept. For example, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe is a federally recognized tribe in Massachusetts. And they, of course, use that term, and they are quite comfortable with that. The Pokanoket, as you may imagine, do not like that term or want that term because it removes their agency. It removes their history as the ones who were the tribe that was basically in control of all these other tribes in southern Massachusetts and southeastern Rhode Island. I'm going to go over a timeline of the Aquidneck Island acquisition. We're going to talk a little bit about Prudence Island because poor Prudence Island never gets really mentioned when we talk about Portsmouth history. They get left out in the cold. Talk a little bit about the early legislation, so in the late 1630s and 1640s mostly. Talk a little bit about the War of New England, also known as Metacom's War or King Philip's War. We all grew up hearing it as King Philip's War. The next more politically correct term would be, let's call it Metacom's War, since his indigenous name was Metacom. Again, but because this wasn't just his war, and to be honest with you, he did not even want to start the conflict. It was his people, his warriors that really pushed him into it. It takes away, it puts too much on Metacom's shoulders to even call it that. So I've spoken to some indigenous people, and some Narragansett in particular, who prefer the War of New England to describe that war, because it wasn't just here in southern New England. It went all throughout New England, all the way up into Maine. And it wasn't just a one-year war, 1675 and 76, that was happening here in the south of New England. It lasted for a couple more years after that. So in many ways, it was a war for all of New England. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what happened after the war, including indentures of some local indigenous people. And then some trials of a couple indigenous people here in Portsmouth, Peter Mott and Job Slocum. Most of what I'm going to be discussing is not going to be happy news. As you can imagine, almost all of this information has come from English records of the 17th and 18th century, and they would have only written about the indigenous people whenever there was an issue, a problem. I have not found a single historic record that talks about a happy time. You know, we invited the Pokanoket to have a feast with us. So all of these records are unfortunately of a negative slant, so they're a little biased in that way. Here, I just want to put out some terms, and I don't expect you to read all of these, and some of these slides have a lot of writing, and by all means, this lecture and the same one, I gave the same lecture last year, are on YouTube, so if you want to take a little more time to look at these slides, please do. But I did want to just give some of the names of the indigenous people and places and tribes that you may not be familiar with, that we don't hear that often or see that often. When I was at URI getting my graduate degree, I was a teacher's assistant, so I taught a few classes. And in one of the history classes, I asked the students to write down 5 names of famous people, anyone you could think of from the 19th century, 18th century, 17th century. They had no problem doing that. They were all of white people, almost all, a few black people were included. When I asked them to give me a few names of a few indigenous people from the 17th, 18th, 19th century, they could come up with 1 or 2. Pocahontas, I think, was the only one they basically could come up with. So it's just something I want to put out there, that these names were very, very important years ago and should be remembered again. So some of the nations, the Pokanoket, the Pocasset, the Sakonnet, the Narragansett, places, Aquidneck, I am not going to try to pronounce that. That is Prudence Island. The Chibakawisa. I probably really messed that up. Pocasset, both a name and a place. Both the name of the tribe, the Pocasset tribe, and also a place name. So northern Aquidneck Island, northern Portsmouth, around Common Fence Point, Island Park, was Pocasset. And also across the Sakonnet, going into the Tiverton area, it was Pocasset territory. This town, its original name, was the town of Pocasset. We were the town of Pocasset for 1 to 2 years. I've seen different records, either in 1639 or 1640, started using the name Portsmouth instead of Pocasset. People, Canonicus and Miantinomu or Miantinomi, they were sachems of the Narragansett. Yotesh, Asatomet, Mishaba, these were also minor sachems here on Aquidneck Island. Below that, Washaganesset, Wanumatonomi. So some of you may recognize that name as the golf course in Middletown. If you go onto that golf course website, it says that Wanumatonomi was the governor of this island. He was a sachem, but as the Narragansett today will tell you, the title sachem equates more to mayor today than a governor, because there were numerous sachems. Here on Aquidneck Island, for example, at the time we acquired it, I'm going to go over this in just a minute, there were at least a half dozen sachems on the island. So Wanumatonomi was just one of those sachems. So he was not the sachem over the entire island. Where his little part of the island was, I'm not positive, but just a little information about that. Usamwiquin, that is the man who the Pilgrims first met. He is better known as Massasoit. And Massasoit, though, is a title. So you may have heard Massasoit dealing with the Pilgrims, such as Bradford. But Massasoit translates basically into the great sachem. So he was the great sachem over all the tribes here in southern Rhode Island, southeastern Rhode Island, southern Massachusetts. So the Pokanoket was the tribe mostly headquartered in Soames, which is basically today in Bristol, Mount Hope area. And he was the sachem of that tribe, but also the great sachem of the entire confederation of tribes. And it's important, I think, to remember his name, because that is what his name was, Usamwiquin. I'm sorry if I do not know how to pronounce it correctly. Again, Massasoit was his title. His 2 sons were Wamsutta, also known as Alexander, and Metacomet, that we know as Philip. Weedamo, who was a Sunsquaw. Sunsquaw was, I believe, the female term for a sachem. She was sachem off the island on the mainland. Now, the area that we're talking about is, as I mentioned, southeastern Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts. The map on the left, you see it's using the term Wampanoag, and that comes from the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project. And I believe it's through the Mashpee Wampanoags who are doing that. They're reclaiming their ancient language. The map on the right was done in 1895, and it's a government map. And both of these used historic records to try to determine exactly what part of New England was controlled by the Wampanoag, or rather the Pokanoket. So again, prior to 1675, we would say all that land was Pokanoket land. After the War of New England, after Metacom's War, we call it Wampanoag. They're basically the same, but you might notice that the government one does not list Cape Cod as part of Pokanoket territory, but it does list Nantucket. The other one does not list Nantucket, but it does list Cape Cod. The important part for us, though, is both the maps show Aquidneck Island. Both the maps show Aquidneck Island as being part of the Pokanoket/Wampanoag Federation. And that is how it was prior to the Pilgrims coming here. I'll talk about that in just a second. So when I visited the Mashpee Wampanoag Museum, and I do recommend all of you to go there as well, it's a lovely little museum, but outside they have this great wetu, also known as a wigwam. So the indigenous peoples here of this area created homes exactly like that. It is covered in tree bark, and there's the inside of it. It seems so much larger inside than it does looking at it from the outside. They would make their fire in the middle. I don't believe they had a smokestack to let the smoke out. These were very smoky structures. Some of the English were not very kind in their descriptions of the environment being inside one of these wetus when the fire was going and everyone was in there. At the same museum, they have a dugout canoe. And it's really fascinating to watch indigenous people create one of these canoes. They burn out the center of it. Just recently in Mystic, for example, some of the indigenous people were there creating a dugout canoe that they have just been working on these past few months. I'm sure they're done with it by now. And it's just a fascinating thing to watch, the process of it being made. So these are the types of canoes that the indigenous peoples throughout North America and the Caribbean would have used, and probably South America as well. I'm not familiar enough to make that statement. I was in the Caribbean a few years ago, and there was a dugout canoe on the beach of the island I was at. I'm not sure how old it was. It didn't look like it could float, but it must have been there a very long time. So some of the indigenous leaders that we're going to be talking about, on the left, there is a modern statue of the Massasoit Usamequin. He was the Pokanoket sachem. He lived from 1581 roughly to 1661, almost 80 years. 80 years is a good long life nowadays for people, let alone 350 years ago. His son, Metacomet, or Philip, was sachem since 1662 until he was killed in 1676. He died fairly young. You see he was, 38 when he died. Now, just recently, the Pokanoket Nation has just unveiled this mural up in East Providence. And that is why I included that today in this lecture, because the mural is depicting Metacomet. Now, that depiction is by the current Pokanoket Great Sachem Sagamore, William Windsor Thunder Guy. So I thought it was very appropriate to use that very recently. It was just a few weeks ago this mural was unveiled. And it's meant to represent his ancestor. So William is, I believe, the 12th or 11th, the 11th generation descendant of Metacomet. And so they used him as the model for depicting his ancestor. On the right, we have a monument to Miantinomi. He was the Narragansett sachem for just a few years before he died. I could not find any depiction of Miantinomi, any good depiction. The only artistic depiction I could find of him is when he was killed by Uncas. And it's not a very friendly, and it's not a very nice picture to see him on the ground being killed. So I just included his monument there. So how the Narragansetts acquired this great island of Aquidneck. Now, any of you that may have grown up here on the island, if you went to schools here, you were probably taught the same thing I was taught. Our ancestors, the English, bought this island fair and square from the Native Americans. Well, at the time, me growing up, they would have just said Indians. This island was bought fair and square from the Indians, and they would wipe their hands of it. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But what led up to the English acquiring this island, what happened before that, was something called the Great Dying. So disease swept through the Pokanoket, Wampanoag territory between 1615 and 1619. That was later described as miraculous plagues by John Winthrop of Boston. About that time, or a few years earlier, the weakened and depleted Pokanoket/Wampanoag, Mr. P there, succumbed to the more numerous Narragansett in a series of battles, including the Battle of Aquidneck. So, as we saw on those maps, the Pokanoket controlled this island at least prior to the Great Dying, prior to 1615. When these diseases swept through this area, the Narragansett were barely affected at all. The Pokanoket and other tribes lost up to two-thirds of their population. So if you could just imagine, oh my goodness. So if you could just imagine the powerful Pokanoket nation losing two-thirds of their people, still being in conflict every now and then with the Narragansett, and now the Narragansett, who almost didn't lose any people, now had the advantage. The Narragansett now had the upper hand. This is more oral. The battles for Aquidneck Island, as far as I can tell, is more oral history. I can't find any written record, and there wouldn't be a written record from the Indigenous, but even a written record from the English from the 17th century discussing that. What I have found are history books from the 19th century that talk about it. Specifically, the area they talk about as the final battle of Aquidneck happened, it's something like 3 miles north of the Newport Townhouse. And I went and mapped it out last year, and it brings you right to basically where Petco is, where Walgreens is. So behind Petco and Walgreens, between there and the airport, there is still today very swampy, wet area. I believe there's a brook that goes through there. And I've actually spoken with some local people in Middletown who said, oh yes, when I was younger, we found lots of arrowheads in that area. So based on circumstantial evidence, it certainly seems as if this oral history of a battle may very well have taken place. Now, so comes 1620, when the Pilgrims show up, Usamakwen, the Massasoit Usamakwen, is in a precarious position. He doesn't have enough manpower, enough warriors to even secure, the land he already has. He's already lost the islands here in Narragansett Bay. And so he befriends the English. He sees the English as his savior, as allies to help him defend his territory against the Narragansett. And it did work like that for a little while. So when it finally came time, after 1636, Roger Williams, of course, got permission from the Narragansett and the Massasoit to settle Providence. So when Anne Hutchinson and William Coddington, when they were looking for a place, they got a hold of Roger Williams and said, hey, can you speak to the indigenous people for us? Of course, they said Indians. And try to secure a place for us to go, because Anne is being banished from Boston. So Roger Williams spoke to Canonicus and Miantinomi, the two sachems of the Narragansett. That's a peculiar arrangement, from what I hear, amongst the indigenous peoples in this area, to have two sachems. From what I've been told by the Narragansett, they're the only tribe around that historically they have had that. And Miantinomu, and Canonicus agreed to allow Roger Williams' friends, meaning William Coddington and Ann Hutchinson and the rest, to settle on Aquidneck Island. It's important to realize this. So the Narragansett are a tribe of thousands of people. The English, just a few hundred and such. And so they had the upper hand in the beginning. And so they were the gracious ones allowing the English to come onto the island. Why would they do that? For allies, basically. So the Narragansett knew that the Pokanoket had already allied themselves with the English. And so now they can garner favor with the English by being friendly with them as well. So this is what we learned at school, the first couple lines right there. 1637, the Narragansett allowed Coddington and others to settle on the island. A gratuity is given to these sachems consisting of 40 fathoms of white beads, so 40 fathoms of wampum, which are the quahog shells, as in white beads, 10 coats and 20 hose, also given to compensate the Narragansetts in having the island. And then one of the minor sachems also received 5 fathom of wampum at that very same time. So that's what we learned in school when I was young, except for the 5 fathoms for Wanamatunuits. That was never mentioned. I guess it seemed kind of minor. And we thought the sale was done and over with, but it wasn't. A year later, Usamaquin was given 5 fathoms of wampum. I imagine he had a talk with the English in some way, said, why are you giving all of this to the Narragansett? This used to be my island. You're my ally. So he ends up getting the 5 fathoms. But then it continues on, and you could just read through that very quickly if you want to. So this went on, as you can see, for 2.5, almost 3 years, of the English giving gifts to the indigenous on the island to get them off the island, because the English wanted the whole island for themselves and didn't want to have to deal with any indigenous. June 1639, Wanamatunuits was given 5 fathoms for ground broken up or any other title or claim that he had to the island. So it's interesting, those two that mentioned for ground broken up. So I imagine those indigenous people said, hey, I've been on this island for years. I've just tilled this land to plant these crops. And now you're saying I have to get off the island? Well, yes. Let's give you a few fathoms of wampum. Is that enough? And there you go. And then finally, all the way into November 1639, when Miantinomi himself received 23 coats, 13 hoes, and 2 tarkeets to distribute to the Indians that did inhabit of the island of Aquidneck, in full of all promises, debts, and demands for the said island. So at this point, the English person who wrote this was probably fed up. Said, we've had enough. We keep giving you gifts. Is it over? And to the English, it should have been over back in 1637. But to the indigenous, that's not how they worked. They didn't have the same concept of buying and selling, of possessing something. Things were more shared amongst the people. And so this is why there was such confusion. The way I like to say it sometimes is many of the indigenous did not get the memo. They didn't get the memo that this island was no longer theirs. So they kept coming on year after year, month after month. They continued to come on the island like they had done their whole lives for decades and centuries. And that creates some problems that we will see. So we might be confused. The average English person 350 years ago may have been confused, and the indigenous people back then may have been confused as to this whole transfer of this island. Is it still ours? Is it the English? Was it sold? But Roger Williams was not confused at all. And this is what the letter he wrote to John Winthrop in June 1638. Sir, concerning the islands, Prudence and Aquidneck, neither of them was sold properly. For 1,000 fathom, meaning 1,000 fathom of wampum, would not have bought either by strangers, What Roger Williams is saying is if a stranger had gone up to Mantonome, Connecticut and say, hey, I'll give you 1,000 fathom of wampum for Prudence Island, according to Roger Williams, they would have been turned away because that's not how the indigenous people work. They wanted to help their friends. If you're a friend of mine, I will help you. If you're not my friend, then no amount of money is going to cause me to give you this land that is for my friends. The land is for their friends. The truth is, not a penny was demanded for either, and what was paid was only gratuity. If you leave here tonight with only one bit of information, this is the one thing I hope all of you will remember, and I hope this gets passed down year after year to every class of history here in every school on this island, that this island wasn't sold or bought in the way that you and I know about buying and selling things. That deed from 1637 did not mean the same thing to the indigenous people as a deed means to you and I today. Though I chose for better assurance and form to call it sale. Roger Williams knew that his English companions don't understand and would not agree with this friendly sharing of the land. He knew that the English, that William Coddington, Anne Hutchinson, and the rest expected that the island would be theirs, completely theirs. And so he called it a sale. That being said, still, this form of transferring the island is still 100 times better than, unfortunately, what many indigenous people suffered throughout the rest of this continent throughout the centuries. So Prudence Island, Chibagawisa, Connecticut and Mantonome gave the island to Mr. Oldham on the condition that he moved there, but he never did. So again, here are the indigenous peoples, the Narragansett, willing to give an entire island to someone as a friend, as a friendly gesture, for them to be a part of their tribe, for them to be friends with them. So then, since Mr. Oldham never did that, the Narragansett gave the island to Roger Williams. Williams accepted half the island, with the other half reserved for John Winthrop. Though he expressed a desire to build a home and live there, it does not appear that Williams ever did. The stone pictured is Pulpit Rock. The sign says, on this rock, Roger Williams preached to the Indian inhabitants of Prudence Island. And that may be the case. I am not sure. I keep hitting the wrong one. Okay. So here we go. Now that 2.5, almost 3 years of the English trying to get full control of this island has failed, they now have to create more and more laws to deal with the indigenous that are still on the island. Now, this is me just paraphrasing, but this is exactly what every one of these laws say. All these are from, I believe, 1640 up to 1647. So the indigenous, or they'll say Indians, can build no fires, no traps, do not kill boar, do not take or destroy deer or cattle, do not be unruly, do not take any canoe. And that, again, comes from, as I mentioned earlier, to the indigenous, the canoes are to be shared. What do you mean that's your canoe? What does that mean? I need to use a canoe? I'm going to use it. That's not how the English look at it. This is my canoe. Don't you touch my canoe. Do not break any contracts. That, of course, becomes a very ironic one right there in the future. Do not loiter. Do not come to our homes. Do not fall any trees upon the islands. Do not peel any trees upon the islands, meaning peel the bark off to make their wigwams / weetus. Basically, what they're saying is, only come to the island when we invite you to do business. Once you do your business, leave. Do not trade or barter with the French or Dutch. Do not skulk about the island. What's the difference between skulking and loitering? I don't know. But either way, they wanted to make sure that the indigenous didn't do it. Now, this last one is for the English. This law is for the English. Do not sell, give, deliver, or in any other ways convey any powder, shot, gun, pistol, sword, or any other engine of war to the Indians. That last one was repeated several times from several different towns, Newport, Portsmouth, in several different ways, several different wordings to say the same thing, basically. But it didn't matter. The Indigenous had muskets, and from the earliest times all the way through King Philip's War. By the end of this lecture, I'll remember to press the right button. Oh, I know what it is. I'm holding it upside down. That's what it is. So I found this particular entry very interesting. So in September 1642, Roger Williams consulted and agreed with Mantinomi, sachem of the Narragansetts, for the destruction of the wolves that are now upon the island. But in no way does this allow you to kill deer. So there's a couple things here with this. First, if you wondered why there are no wolves on the island, or really anywhere left in America, it's because wolves and European settlement do not go hand in hand very well. Wolves will attack sheep and chickens, and it's just not an arrangement that European settlers want to deal with. So almost all the wolves were killed in America. Up until about 100 years ago, I think the only place there were any wolves was in Wyoming, Yosemite area, Yellowstone area. But because the wolves were removed from not only this island, but most of the U.S., that then allowed the coyotes from the southwest to spread. So coyotes are sort of like rats and squirrels in that they love human-built environments. Coyotes flourish in human-built environments, just like rats and squirrels do. And so once the wolves were gone, the coyotes were loving it. And it took them a while to get here. Coyotes finally made it here to this island about 30 years ago. So we had a break. We had a break of over 300 years of no wolves and no coyotes on the island. But now we got coyotes, so. Nope. Now that I turned it right side up, I found myself doing it the wrong way. I'm just going to hold it like this. So I just wanted to go over a couple of these laws here. So 1644, Usama Quinn, who was the Massasoit, the Grand Sachem of the Pokanoket, with 10 men shall have leave to kill 10 deer within the liberty of Portsmouth. And the aforementioned deer they shall bring to the town to Mr. Brenton and Mr. Balston, and they to view them, and to depart from off the island within 5 days. So how odd is that to create an actual law allowing a group of people to take 10 deer, just 10, and then being very specific to make sure that they leave the island, in a short period of time, in this case within 5 days. I also think it must have been very frustrating, if not humiliating, to Osama Quinn to have to even ask the English here in Portsmouth for that favor. Mr. Balston, he's an interesting character. He was the beer brewer. So I encourage you all, if you like beer, to research Mr. Balston. He was the first one to brew beer in the colony. I believe it was up in Providence first, and then he brewed it here in Portsmouth. Now, just 1 month later, a law, act and deed of the voluntary free submission of the chief sachem and the rest of the princes. Basically what that is saying, and that was signed by Pesicus, the Narragansett sachem. I wonder if Pesicus knew what he was signing. What this document was in April 1644 was giving the English full control of the Narragansett. Just completely giving up their own sovereignty. I wonder if Pesicus really knew what it was that the English were asking him to do. I'm going to leave that on the floor. That's where it wants to be right now. Next, a few months later, it is ordered that all the Indians in the town shall depart forthwith to live in the woods with their effects. If they appear again, they shall forfeit. So a couple things on that one right there. Again, here we are 7 years after the English tried to have full control of the island with no indigenous people on it. 7 years, and clearly there are still indigenous people on the island, because now the town of Portsmouth is saying, don't come into town anymore. Now at that time, town would have been around the town pond, I would imagine, is where our village was initially. So what they were saying in 1644 is, don't come in here. go into the deep woods, which is probably where we're standing right now. Anything south of the Town Pond area was, pretty much the deep woods. So the indigenous people were still here on the island at that time. And if they appeared again, they will forfeit. It doesn't say what they would forfeit. Forfeit their lives? Forfeit property? I do not know. Again, May 1650, it's ordered that Pesicus shall have liberty to get so many chestnut rinds upon the common, so he could make himself a wigwam, provided he take John Green with him, that no wrong may be done to any particular person on the island. Again, how humiliating, must that be? Not only is Pesicus asking for permission to just strip some bark from a few trees to make himself a wigwam, he is to be chaperoned to make sure he doesn't offend anyone or hurt anyone on the island. It just floors me to read something like that. Now, that particular one came out of the court of Newport. So I don't know if Pesicus actually went on the south part of the island to Newport to get his bark, or did that in Portsmouth. Everything else I tried to get to make sure it was very specific to Portsmouth. But some things, because Portsmouth and Newport were so intertwined in the early years, some of these laws apply to both communities. May 1667 ordered that the Indians residing upon the island shall be forthwith disarmed of all sorts of arms. So again, so many laws were being created from 1640 all the way up until 1675 to try to keep weapons out of the hands of the indigenous. Now this is practically word for word the law that Samuel Gorton created in 1652. It's the first anti-perpetual slavery law in America. At the time, 1652, the colonies were not fully united. This wasn't the colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. It was two separate colonies. Rhode Island was one, and then Providence and Warwick was a separate colony. So technically, when this law was passed, it didn't have effect here on Aquidneck Island. That being the case, it does seem as if that the people here on Aquidneck Island followed this law. So it basically says that no one can be enslaved for their entire lives. 10 years is the maximum indenture that you can enslave someone, black or white. Now, it doesn't mention indigenous, but as you may imagine, English at that time considered indigenous, with the blacks, basically. But if the child was taken before the age of 14, they would be freed at 24. So if you can imagine, if you were an 8-year-old child, you could actually spend, how many years is that? 16 years as a slave until you reach the age of 24. If you're older than 14, then irregardless of your age, you could only be indentured / enslaved for 10 years. Now this will come up again. Now, I put that slide where it was, again, because I'm going chronologically. That was 1652, and now here's this one, 1663. Just to give you an example of the difference between the indenture of a white English person or the indenture of an indigenous person. So Gabriel Jennings was a white child. He was indentured to William Wodell here in Portsmouth for 14 years and 2 months. So clearly, he would have been 9 years and 10 months old at this time, if I did my math right, yes, to make sure that he was freed when he reached the age of 24. So this follows that law, that 1652 law. And after his indenture, he was going to get 2 suits of apparel, 1 cow, and 1 mare foal, weanable. However, if he died before then the family would only get a cow. It doesn't seem like much, but that is a really good deal when you see the indentures for the indigenous that will come up a little later. So again, kind of going in sort of a chronological order here in a little bit. I wanted to mention that Hog Island was finally acquired by Portsmouth from Wamsutta, Alexander, in 1654. Now I find this fascinating. So in June of 1669, our town clerk here in Portsmouth wrote this letter. And I used to work here in Portsmouth. I worked for the town clerk's office. So this would have been my job. It would have been my job to type up this letter to send to the Massasoit Sachem Metacomet himself, basically a leader of a nation. And the letter basically says you're ordered to remove your hogs and any cattle, anything you have from Hog Island. So Philip used Hog Island, at least he tried to have his swine feed upon the island. But Portsmouth did not like that. That's our island. It's for our English settlers to put our hogs, our swine on the island to feed upon. So I just found this fascinating that they actually sent him a letter ordering him not to. I don't know what came of that. I don't know if he did remove his swine. My guess is he did, because this is 1669 and hostilities didn't start until 1675. Very good. All right, so we're getting close to that now. So as of 1675, right before the war broke out, here is a map showing roughly the territory. So what's down in the bottom, which looks like it's white or gray, that's us. That's the colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. You see the Narragansett to the west on the mainland. That orange area, rusty colored area, that would be the Plymouth colony, English. Above that is Boston or Massachusetts. And you see below that, you see Wampanoag. Again, at this time, it'd be Pokanoket, okay? So the Pokanoket, who were headquartered in the Mount Hope area, controlled all the tribes in that green area that you see. So that was at the start of the war. Now, I do want to kind of read through this right here. This is never good to have so much writing on a screen, because the people in the audience tend to read and not listen to me. But either way, either hear me or read yourself, because I'm going to read it too. So key local events. So Metacom may have negotiated a truce with the leaders of Portsmouth, since the Society of Friends, otherwise known as the Quakers, were pacifists, and Philip's grievance was with the mainland English. Regardless, no attacks occurred on Aquidneck Island, but Benjamin Church and others from the Great Swamp Massacre recovered from wounds in Newport. I'll review that again in just a minute. So as early as 1671, a council of war met at George Lawton's house for securing the inhabitants and their estates in these times of imminent danger. So this kept building and building through the 1640s, 50s, 60s. Even though the war didn't start until 1675, all the way back to 1671, the colonists believed they were in imminent danger of attack by the Indigenous. Now, George Lawton's house was right down the street, Lawton Valley area. So it does not exist today, but the foundation that's there could have been his house. That foundation, there's a stone cellar right off the access road by the water plant, and that could be the foundation for his house where they met at that time. Then jumping ahead to April 1675, boats were ordered to patrol the bay for island defense. A third of the men came from Portsmouth. So if you ever learned anything at all about King Philip's War, Metacom's War, the War of New England, you may have learned that it had nothing to do with this island. But that's another sort of misconception I wanted to dispel. So there were these connections to the island. The first connection being the fact that they did not attack the island. Why? The only reasonable explanation, and I've seen this written before, I don't know if it's more oral history or if there's a written document to confirm it, is, like I say, because of the Quakers being pacifists, not willing to engage in battle against the Indigenous themselves. Once they explained that to Metacomet, I'm sure he said, "Okay, fine, let's be neutral in this." But the men in Portsmouth still participated in this patrol around the island. Now, that must have been a fascinating thing. If anyone has ever tried sailing around this island or taking a boat around this island, it takes a long, long time. This is really a big island to circumnavigate. And were they in canoes going around the island? That was quite an ordeal, I would think. In March of 1676, the inhabitants were ordered to sell and send their Indian men and women from this town. So this is during the war. So the war started in the summer of 1675. So this is during the war. As the war was going on, the summer of 1675, the fall, some of the Indigenous were getting captured, and they were being sold into slavery. They were being enslaved. and or maybe even indentured. We don't have all the details on that. So, but as of March, the leaders in Portsmouth were saying, no, it's too dangerous. It's too dangerous for you to keep any indigenous people here in town. You need to get them out of the town. We've been lucky that Metacomet has not attacked us. But if we have indigenous people here that we have enslaved, maybe he will, or maybe your indentured or enslaved indigenous people will rise up against you. So they were ordered to sell and send away anyone that they had. April of 1676, this to me is a very fascinating little tidbit. 100 acres in Portsmouth were set aside for refugees from the mainland. So when Metacomet's warriors were attacking the mainland towns, they were burning these towns, just burning them down. Providence, Warwick, I believe, dozens of them were destroyed. So specifically, the inhabitants from Providence, I know, were invited to come to the island, to come to Portsmouth as refugees until things settled down, until they could go back and rebuild Providence. I'm not sure of any other towns that would have come, people from any other mainland towns, but definitely Providence. August of 1676, Benjamin Church. So Benjamin Church is considered our nation's first ranger, if you want to look at it that way. He learned to fight the indigenous peoples by fighting them their way, by fighting the way they fought, not lining up in a nice, pretty row as the British would do, but more guerrilla warfare. And so Benjamin Church was one of the main leaders of the English fighting this war for the English against the Narragansett, against the Pokanoket. As of August 1676, he was in Newport, and he got word from one of Philip's warriors that Philip had come back to Mount Hope. And at that time, Church and others rode north, so along the West Road, along West Main Road. So if you could just imagine, Benjamin Church, a half dozen men on horseback, riding along West Main Road, all the way to Bristol Ferry, hopped on the ferry and went across the bay. And there, one of the indigenous people with Benjamin Church, his name was John Alderman, he's the one who actually shot Philip and killed Philip. Philip had a premonition, or one of Philip's men had a premonition that he would never be killed by an Englishman. And it's true, he wasn't. He was not killed by an Englishman. He was killed by another indigenous person. Really quick, I was jumping ahead to 1680. I should have put the population prior to 1620 or in 1670 and such, but I didn't. But as of 1680, the English population in New England was 68,000. The indigenous population in New England was 7,000. So those numbers were completely flipped on their head maybe 40 years before. And I wish I had put all of those numbers on here, but I did not do that this time. Another small connection that Portsmouth has to the War of New England is this headstone that we have right downstairs and in storage, actually. It's the headstone of Susanna Eldridge. She died December 1675 at age 14 months. She was the great-granddaughter of Anne Hutchinson. She was the granddaughter of Susanna Hutchinson, who was the only survivor from the August 1643 attack. So when Anne Hutchinson left Portsmouth, she was only here for 4 years. She took most of her family with her, and just a couple years later, she and her family were slaughtered by the indigenous people there. But one daughter, Susanna, survived that attack, and she grew up to be an adult and had children and had this granddaughter. So Susanna, it's believed, it's known that her family was on the mainland. So since she was buried here, December 1675, it's believed that her family came here for safety during the war, left the mainland. I believe it was the Warwick area, and that's why she was here at that time. And not sure how she passed away, but the stone was found in Portsmouth some years ago, and we just don't know where the actual burial is. Little look at the maps and how they changed over the decades. So on the far left, the 1651 map. a Dutch map showing Narragansetts on Rhode Island. So remember, we acquired the island 1637, by 1639. Yet here we are, 1651, and there are still indigenous people on the island. In 1675, that map in the middle showing Pokanoket country. It's hard to read it, but that's what it says on the very top. Right below that also says King Philip's country. And that's the situation prior to the summer of 1675. By 1690, however, this map by Christopher Brown shows nothing of the name Pokanoket or King Philip. It simply shows Mount Hope being where the Pokanoket tribe was originally headquartered. So this is why I wanted to show that indenture of Gabriel Jennings, to juxtapose it with these couple indentures I'm going to show you. So this was Hannah. Hannah was an Indian woman. That's how she was described in the record. And she was sold into perpetual servitude and slavery. What's very interesting is this was January 1677. I can only imagine that after this was written, someone must have come to Mr. William Waddell and said, there's a law on the books since 1652 that no one can be in perpetual slavery. You can't do it. So then a year later, we've got this little addendum. The above named Indian woman hereby declares that she is willing to be servant to the above named William Waddell in manner and form above, meaning perpetually. Was she really willing? I mean, so it's very interesting that on the one hand, they follow the laws, but then maybe this has always happened. They look for ways around the law. These indentures right here are also to William Waddell. So William Waddell, and I'm sorry, it was months ago that I read about it. He was very prosperous here in Portsmouth, and I believe it was textile manufacturing in some way. So all of the indigenous people that he enslaved were, I believe, working in that capacity. And so the interesting one here, it's just a 3-year indenture for this Indian woman, late of Pocasset, to William Waddell. I wonder why it was only 3 years. Was she 21, perhaps? If so, that would explain it. She, or not. I'm not sure why it was just 3 years. But then for this child, 15-year indenture of Hannah, 6-year-old daughter of Meekwapu. So that would, I'm surprised it was only 15 years. If she was 6, 15, 6 is 21. They could have gone a few more years till she was 24, right? And then a 10-year indenture of Peter. It is very difficult to find any documentation on any specific indigenous person here in Portsmouth during almost any period of time, to be quite honest with you. So this is why I'm showing these, because it's what we have. It's few and far between, but this is what we have. And this is the situation after King Philip's War, after Metacom's War, in that now, so the Pocasset, led by Weetamoo, right? They allied themselves with Metacomet. So they were on the losing side. When the English won the war, the Pocasset were on the losing side, and so I can only imagine that Meekwapu's husband was probably killed. He was either killed or sold into slavery out of the area. And so now she's in a desperate situation with her and her children, and this is the situation she found herself in, unfortunately. Here's one here for Indian Sam. Also a little bit interesting because it's just a 1-year indenture. But again, because these documents are so few and far between, I really wanted to share them with y'all tonight. Again, coming up with inquests into indigenous deaths. These are not happy events. These are not happy bits of information of history that I was able to find. the English didn't go out of their way to write a few sentences about this healthy indigenous person over here having a good time, but they wrote when they found a body. Of all the ones I read, and I read probably a dozen, I've only put a few up here as samples, not a single one indicated any foul play. Every indigenous person they found deceased, they say was an accident. Or, as in the second one down, an Indian lad of Widow Fish being found dead in the woods of Portsmouth, to the best of our judgment, that he murdered himself, being found upon the ground with a walnut peeling hanging over him upon a limb of a tree. Which is, it's depressingly sad for several reasons. He probably did kill himself. I mean, if you can imagine the situation these people now find themselves in, going from being the leaders of this area to now being nothing, enslaved. With no nation, with no hope. And also, I included the few, or the one that had an actual name. So the very top one there, Portsmouth, being much distempered with drink, was bewildered of the cold and lost his life. Maybe, and we have no idea, or was he murdered? I mean, again, they find a deceased indigenous person, and it's cold, and it's perhaps just an assumption. But I included him because at least it includes his name. You see all the other ones just say Indian lad, or an Indian man, or Indian woman. This is how mostly all of these show. So I just wanted to give a little bit of recognition to at least a few names of a few people that existed. They were here. And really quick, on Indian lad. So when we hear the word lad, we think of a small child. A lad at this time, was a person who took care of horses. So that he could have been 10 years old, he could have been 50 years old. We don't know by it saying lad. Okay. So we're getting close to the end here. I do want to give a few stories, specific stories. Again, not happy stories. So this is the story of Job, who is said to have murdered two sons of Giles Slocum. What we can ascertain as a definite fact is that this slave of Giles Slocum, named Job, went with Giles' two sons in a boat out in the water. And Job made it back to shore, and the two sons didn't. That's all we really know. The newspaper article you're reading there on top, that's from June 27, 1712. It was in the Boston News Leader. Says, an Indian servant man belonging to Mr. Giles Slocum of Portsmouth carried out to sea in a canoe two of his master's sons. So right away, carried out to sea sounds like he kidnapped them. If he was going to kill them, why would he go out of his way to carry them out to sea, to force them? How do you force two kids to get into a boat? They're kids. They could have just run off. I don't know. One 10, the other 9 years old, whom he killed and drowned, and being examined before the authority, confessed that he knocked the eldest child in the head with the paddle, and seeing the younger crying, he designedly overset the canoe and swam ashore himself, who is now in irons in prison till he is tried for his murder. How did this reporter get that information? Who did Job allegedly confess to? Because at the trial, Job pled not guilty. I mean, if he already confessed, and he knows he's going to be killed, why not just continue saying, yeah, I did it, and this is why I did it? So it's just one of these things. We really don't know exactly what happened or why. What we do know is we have an indigenous person enslaved by an Englishman 36 years after indigenous people lost all their sovereignty in this area after the war. But either way, Job's body, he was hanged. His body was gibbeted. He may have been executed by firing squad. I found two different sources that say the two different things. He may have been killed by the firing squad and then put in the iron cage. And then either way, his body was displayed on Miantinomi Hill. Show of hands, who has been on the top of Miantinomi Hill? Awesome. For those of you who haven't, I recommend going. it's a beautiful spot. It is a spot that has seen so much history, from the Indigenous in the 1600s, going hundreds of years before that, all the way up until today. It's kind of hard to imagine, if you go up there today, that there are no trees. So today there's plenty of trees, and you can't see that far. If you're in the town of Newport, anywhere in Middletown, and you look up, you see the tower, Mantonomi Tower, but that's about it. You see trees on the tower. But at this time, there were no trees at all. So if you just stood up, you could be seen for miles and miles around. So that's why they displayed the bodies of convicted murderers there for others to see. Job had good company up there, not at the same time. Sometime before that, it was Mr. Cornell for the murder, alleged murder of his mother, Thomas Cornell. He was also displayed up on the hill. And then buried by the restaurant, the driveway. For all of you that know the Valley Inn restaurant, that was the old Cornell homestead, and that's where he's buried as soon as you pull in the driveway, right there. One more story I'm going to talk about Peter. And he was enslaved by Jacob Mott Jr. So the Mott farmhouse stood roughly where the public house is now, just a little bit southwest of where the public house is, where the current business office building is where the Mott farmhouse was. And Adam Mott acquired the land, that went up to about 145 acres, 1640. This house was started at least by 1670, if not earlier, and lasted for a good 300 years. This photo is probably from the very early 1970s, right before the house was dismantled. So the Mott farm is one of America's oldest existing farms, longest lasting farms that remained within the same family. So from 1640 to 1895, that land belonged to a Mott. It was different Motts here and there through the centuries. Sometimes a Mott had to buy out a couple of his siblings, but either way, that 140 some acres, roughly, almost the whole 140, stayed within the Mott family all the way up until 1895. But prior to that, Jacob Mott Jr. owned the property in 1727, and he had an Indian lad named Peter. Again, we don't know how old Peter was. I would imagine somewhere between 15 and 55, but I have no idea, right? Old enough to be able to hold a musket, but not so old that he's not able to do work. So Peter, belonging to Jacob Mott, did maliciously endeavor to murder his said master by discharging at him a gun, shooting him through the hat, so that it was an extraordinary act of providence. Said Mott was not killed. Inasmuch as there was only an intent of mischief, falls not under the law. That little bit right there, it sort of confused me at first. I think what the writer was trying to say is that if Peter was just joking around and fooling around, didn't mean to fire the musket, didn't mean to aim it at Jacob, then it wouldn't be a crime. But since he was tried and convicted, they believed that he was intending to kill him. So that the said Indian may have inflicted on him the punishment equalizing the malignity of his crime, and this assembly, having cause to think said Indian may have some accomplices, and that it may be of bad consequence ever to set him at large in this government again, do order that the said Indian lad named Peter shall be branded on the forehead with the letter R, with a hot iron, and be publicly whipped at a cart's tail throughout all the most common corners and places of the town of Newport, as the justices of said town shall think fit to direct. Why Newport? To me, I was very curious why the authorities here in Portsmouth would put this sentence onto another town. Maybe there were more people available to whip poor Peter. Maybe there were more corners in town, so he got more whips, more lashes. To me, that was just odd to see that. Not exceeding The justices said towns shall think fit to direct, not exceeding 10 lashes in one place. So the Portsmouth authorities are saying no more than 10 lashes in one place, but how many places you take them to is up to you. I mean, losing more of that stuff here. Okay. So poor Peter. He had a hard time there. And then Jacob Mott was given the authority to dispose of him so that he would be banished and never to come in again. All right, and the final thing I want to talk about is indigenous labor here on the island, and specifically here in Portsmouth. So after Metacom's War, the War of New England, many of the surviving indigenous people became economically dependent on the colonists. Additionally, indigenous people were imported into New England from Spanish colonies, especially in the early 18th century. So that is just a very depressing bit of information to even think about. Just a few decades before this, there were thousands of indigenous people here. But after disease, after war, after being sent away, there were very few left. So enslaved indigenous people were actually imported from the Caribbean. One of the reasons that the various areas exchanged their indigenous people was because you don't want to enslave someone whose family is a couple miles away. They'll run away from you and go to their family. You want to enslave someone who was taken from thousands of miles away, so they have no way of getting back or getting help from any of their kind, any of their family. In 1748, there were 807 white people, 134 black people. Now, this is just how the census gives the words Negroes back in the day, and 51 Indians, indigenous people living in Portsmouth. In 1774, 54% of all indigenous peoples in Rhode Island were living with a white family, not including those at the reservation near Charlestown. In Portsmouth alone, 100% of the 21 indigenous people lived in a white household. So what that means is, in 1774, there were 21 indigenous people living here in Portsmouth, and they were all enslaved. Whatever word you want to use, indentured, enslaved. Now, that old 1652 law by Samuel Gorton, okay, that said you cannot enslave someone for more than 10 years, that was thrown out the window by this time. So it seemed to still be in effect throughout the 17th century, but in the 18th century, especially with Newport becoming the major slave port here in the Americas, there was no longer a limit on how long to enslave a black person or an indigenous person. That was out the window. That law was never repealed, but it was just ignored. So definitely by the early 18th century, people were being enslaved for as long as they could be. What was I going to say on that? It'll come back to me. Hold on. All right, and so to finish up with indigenous labor, I like this quote right here. The Narragansett and the Warwick Indians are an active, laborious, and ingenious people, which is demonstrated in their labor as they do for the English, especially in making stone fences. Stone fences meaning stone walls. To me, there's a couple of very fascinating things about that sentence. First, just think about the irony that they were dealing with. It was only a century and a half before this time that the land was open, that they could go, indigenous people could go wherever they wanted, that so much of everything was shared amongst them. There were no stone fences. There's a lot of controversy over whether any of the stone structures in New England were created by indigenous people. I believe that some were. There are definitely some cases. But as far as the vast amount of stone walls you see all around, they were not here prior to the English coming. So prior to the English coming, you have a situation where there are no stone walls, okay, where everything is open. And now, as of this time, late 18th century, the indigenous people actually helping to, because they have to. It's not their fault. I mean, and they need to feed themselves and their family. So you take whatever work you can get. So they are now helping to enclose and cut off and separate areas of their ancestors' former land. So to me, it's just a very sad outtake on that. But one interesting thing, at least for me, has to do with when I was a child, and I asked my grandmother, who built all these stone walls that are all around here in Portsmouth? And she said, well, the Indians did. As a kid, I believed it. And then I got older and realized that's not true. That didn't happen. It was the farmers who built the stone walls as they were plowing up their field. Well, maybe Grandma was right, at least partially right. So at least some of these stone walls were built by the Indigenous, but not prior to the English coming. And I believe that was it. Yes. Okay. And